1. I live in a small town, built in bushland where a lot of elderly people reside, so it's safe to say that it's always been a safe neighborhood, and I've never needed to be overly cautious. This is probably why I had often been naive enough to believe that although there is a small possibility of something bad happening to me, I thought it was far too unlikely. At the time, I was 15 years old, and I used to go out on weekends to visit my boyfriend at the time, who lived quite a while away from me. I wasn't able to drive at this age, so public transport was my only means of going over to visit him. This meant walking about 20 minutes from my house to a bus stop, catching the bus into the city, and then catching a train to his house. I was used to doing the same trip every week, and I felt safe taking the trip by myself. As I was only able to see him one day during the week, I would leave early in the morning to get there and stay until fairly late before going home. Because it was late by the time I left my boyfriend's house, and public transport was less frequent at that hour, it would be a waste of time for my boyfriend to travel any of the way back home with me. So every week, I made the trip back home alone. On one particular night, after visiting my boyfriend, it was a usual ride on the train back into the city, and I was waiting at the bus station. The bus station is a large open building above a number of platforms, on a lower story where the buses would pull in. I was waiting on the upper story on a bench in front of the stairs that led to the platform I needed for my bus home. I don't recall there being many people around. Maybe one or two people passing by, but it was essentially deserted because of the late hour. On a side note, because I was visiting my boyfriend, I dressed up to look pretty for him. I was wearing a decent casual dress, I straightened my long hair so that it looked neat, and I had just recently received some high platform boots for my birthday, which I thought looked super cool, and they were fun to wear, because I didn't feel so short. I was ruffling through my bag for some gum, and I noticed someone sit down on the bench next to me. Usually, when someone sits on a bench which is already occupied, they leave a sort of one-person gap between, but this person sat down right beside me despite there being a whole bench available. When I looked up from my bag, I saw a man who was maybe 30 years old. I'm a terrible judge of age, so I'm not really sure. I don't remember too much about his appearance. I think he was bald or had short hair. Being naive, I didn't think to try to remember any details about his appearance, which I would have done had this happened to me now. When our eyes met, he asked me something along the lines, "You got any weed?" At 15, I was a good kid, and didn't have anything to do with smoking or alcohol, and certainly not drugs. I told him no, and continued to sit uncomfortable on the bench waiting for the bus. Then he gestured up towards the bus schedule above the stairs to the platform and asked me, "Where are you heading?" As if him asking me about drugs wasn't a warning sign enough for me not to tell him where I was going. I obediently told him that I was catching the 123 bus to XYZ. Coincidentally, he responded with, "Oh, me too." I found this to be a bit unlikely since it was a small town where the bus was headed, but it was still possible that he was actually headed this way. I started to get suspicious at this point, and I was already feeling very uncomfortable. I looked down at my phone in hopes that he wouldn't talk to me anymore. He noticed this and asked me what phone service I was with. I told him the service and he said, "I've got a voucher for phone credit for that service, but I can't use it because I'm with a different service. Do you want it?" I'm not sure if it's the same in the US, but in Australia where I live, we can buy prepaid credit to add call value onto our phone. I politely declined, assuming he had ill intentions but unsure what benefit he would gain from giving me this voucher. In hindsight, maybe he was trying to get my phone number or something. I honestly don't know. He persisted, Are you sure? Why no, I can't use it. But I declined again. No, thank you. Things got weirder after that when he pointed out my big platform shoes and asked, "Is it difficult to run in those shoes?" Creepy. I lied and said, "No, I can run very well in these." He could have asked if it was difficult to walk in them, but no, he didn't. He then gestured to the stairs, down to the bus platform, and suggested that we both go down there to wait for the bus. The platform is very poorly lit, and there was probably no one down there. I did not want to be there alone with this person, so I told him that I was going to wait here, but that he could wait down there if he wanted to. As expected, he didn't move and remained on the bench with me. A few moments later, I noticed someone walking towards us through the bus station. Against all possible odds, it happened to be someone that I recognized. It was my friend's older brother. He was probably about 17 at the time. "Ben!" I almost shouted when I saw him. He made his way over and stood in front of me on the bench. I asked him which bus he was catching, and luckily, it was the same one as me. I was so relieved. We exchanged a few words back and forth, and eventually the creepy guy sitting next to me got up and wandered off. He hadn't said anything while Ben and I were talking. Ben and I went down to the platform and got on the bus when it arrived. Surprisingly, the creepy guy didn't get on the bus like he said he was. I told Ben about what had happened and how he had saved me. I can't imagine what would have unfolded if Ben had not showed up when he did. I would have gone down to the platform when the bus arrived. And hopefully he would not have done anything since there was someone driving the bus, potential witness. If he had gotten as far as getting on the bus with me, I was worried about the 20-minute walk from my bus stop to my house. We are on a dark street, surrounded by bush on one side, and I didn't have credit on my phone to call my mum and ask for a lift. Two. Growing up, I had a lot of fun experiences with sneaking out of the house. My house was 3 floors, a finished basement, a middle floor, and a top floor where all the bedrooms were. When I had friends over, we all slept in the finished basement. It was a mutual agreement between my parents and I. They got to sleep without hearing a peep. We got to be as loud as we wanted. The best part about the basement was the fact that it had a sliding door to go in and out of. Now, anyone with sliding doors knows that most of them are completely silent when opening and closing. This led to at least 50+ instances between the ages of 13 to 16, before we could drive, where a group of friends and I would sneak out to go meet up with girls who lived further down the road. Notice how I said my friends and I. Up until this point, I had never snuck out on my own. It wasn't from fear of sneaking out on my own. It just always was prearranged. That when the girls down the street would have a sleepover, the boys would have a sleepover at my house. There wasn't ever a reason for me to go out alone. However, I was talking to this one girl who lived a little further down the road, and she wanted me to come over and hang out as teenagers do. So, unconcerned, I headed out into the summer night at around 1 a.m. The route to get to this girl's house was on the same route as the other house we would always go to, so I was completely familiar with my surroundings. It was a pretty active suburban neighborhood, so even at hours that late you'd have cars driving around. As a teenager, you didn't particularly want to be seen walking on the side of the road that late, so if you heard a car coming or saw headlights, you would duck into the woods or dive into the nearest bushes you could find. It was a heavily wooded area, so this wasn't challenging. However, there is always one nightmarish stretch of road where there is neither a lot of woods or houses on either side, and if you don't get through that part before a car comes, you're fucked. My friends and I, being the nerds we are, named it Diagon Alley. Harry Potter fans will get it. Cut to me, happy as humanly possible on my way to potentially get laid for the first time, walking through Diagon Alley, not paying attention. All of a sudden a car comes approaching quick, and I run and hide in behind the thin woods behind a group of trees that was hardly covering me at all. 99% of the time the cars just go zooming by, either not seeing you or seeing you but not caring enough to do anything about it. This car stopped in front of the house that was across the street from me. Not totally out of the ordinary yet, maybe they lived there. At this point, I didn't think they had saw me yet. After sitting there for 15 to 30 seconds, the car drove by and took a left. The reason the car turned matters is because Diagon Alley was part of a large circular neighborhood of houses. Where this strange car took a left would eventually loop her, right back to my location. Knowing this and not wanting to be caught in the street, I stayed in my position. Sure enough, no more than a minute later the car came back. This time when it parked, it shined its headlights directly at me. I stood there in complete fear, not knowing what to do. A minute passes, with the headlights on me, and the car proceeds to turn left and go around the circle again. Now I'm thinking that it's time to make my way out of the woods and get the fuck out of there. But as I'm on the edge of the woods, about to hit the road, I hear the car coming and duck back into the woods, trying to find the best spot I can to hide. This time the car parks in the same spot as the first time it approached. The driver sat there for what felt like 10 to 15 minutes, and I was as frozen as ice, paralyzed with fear. The engine turns off and I hear the car door open. This is where the frozen with fear thing subsides, and a fight or flight mode sets in. I booked it out of the woods down the street as fast as I've ever run before. It almost felt inhuman. Instead of pursuing me on foot, the person, I didn't get a look at the face to confirm gender, hopped back in their car and tried to chase me that way. Luckily, I ran up over a hill and immediately ducked into a driveway and rolled underneath a car that was parked a little out of eyeshot. The act of me going over the hill caused me to be out of sight long enough for the person to lose my position completely. For the driver, that wasn't the end, though. They weren't satisfied. The car drove around the big circular road for 45 minutes looking for me. Just going around and around and around. Very slowly. Finally, the car eventually disappeared. I waited an additional 15 to 20 minutes to make sure the car wasn't just trying to bait me to come out. And I took a completely different way back home. I only told my guy friends who used to sneak out with me about it. Never my parents. Never any of the girls. Nobody. My friends thought it could have been the police, but there is no way that's the case. They would have flicked the lights on, yelled at me that I was breaking the law, curfew, anything. Confirmation came that there was an abduction attempt no more than 2 weeks later in a neighborhood adjacent to mine. Who's to say what would have happened? I was a big kid at 16, 5'11", 185. So maybe if she did get a hold of me, I could have fended them off. I'm glad it never had to get to that point. Needless to say, I avoided Diagon Alley like the plague for the next few months. 3. Back in 2010, I had moved into my first apartment alone. Before that, I had always lived with at least 2 or more people. So I was pretty excited to finally have my own apartment all to myself. I didn't live in a particularly bad complex, and it was a decent size 1-bedroom. In this complex, we tended to get a lot of people going door to door selling stuff. Knives, things from catalogs, magazines, stuff like that. I always brushed them off because it usually seemed shady, and I really hate door-to-door salesmen. Well, one morning around 9, I was getting ready to go to work when I heard a knock at my door. It was some guy selling magazines. He launched right into it and told me that he gets dropped off by his leader and walks around the city to different complexes and homes selling these magazines. If he sold a certain amount, he got to take some trip or something. He was probably like 5'9", normal build, and had kind of greasy looking blonde hair. Like the bright ass blonde hair some people have. He was very charismatic, and seemed like a nice guy, but I told him I wasn't interested. He pushed and showed me the kinds they offered, and there were a couple I did actually like to read, and I could get them at a discount if I signed up, which means he suckered me into this shit. What can I say? The guy was nice, and he was around my age and seemed pretty genuine. Why not help him out and get discounted magazines? So I let him in, and we proceeded to fill out some paperwork and all that jazz. He made small talk with me and asked my age and how long I've had my ferrets and stuff like that. We ended up talking for about a half an hour, and I told him I had to leave for work. So we got his stuff, said thanks, and left. At this point, I was a server in a chain restaurant, and I was working a double that day. A couple hours later, I got off and came home. Just when I had gotten changed and sat down, there was a knock on my door. It was that magazine dude from earlier. I thought he may have forgotten something, or maybe the paperwork hadn't gotten finished. So I opened the door. He said hi, and I asked him if he'd forgotten something, and he said, "No, I just enjoyed talking to you, and I've gotten my quota for the day, so I figured I'd see if you were home, and I wanted to hang out while I wait for my leader to come get me. If that's okay." It was a little weird, but I figured it couldn't hurt. I mean, I've got neighbors above and beside me, and across from my door, so why not? I felt pretty safe. I did tell him I was working a split that day, so he couldn't stay long. He ended up hanging out the whole 2 hours I had off, and he left when I left for work. While he was there, we talked about life in general, and I asked about his job. He traveled for it, and he said he and his group were only here in town for a week. Then they go somewhere else to sell the magazines. I thought it sounded pretty cool. He started to confide in me a little that he was tired of it, and wanted to have a normal job and other stuff I can't really remember. I told him if he feels that way, he should just quit and go home. We got off on another subject after that, but I figured that was the last I would see of him. That night at work, I got a text from an out-of-state number that I didn't know. All it said was, "Hey." So I replied back, "Who is this?" It was that fucking magazine guy. At first I wondered how the fuck he got my number, but then I remembered that paperwork had asked for it. I kept cool about it, but at this point I am officially weirded out that this stranger is getting in contact with me so much, after not even really talking a lot, or for the fact that not even really knowing me. I asked what was up, and he asked what I was doing. I told him working, because that's why I had to leave earlier. I guess he thought I was lying because he asked why I was at work so late. It was around 11:30 p.m. to 12 a.m. I told him it was because I closed tonight. He said, "Oh, well, I'm just chilling in my hotel room." I put my phone away and got back to work. I didn't care what he was doing, and I didn't care to talk to him anymore. I finished work, got off, and went home. As I walked up to my door at the apartment, my neighbor was sitting outside with her husband on the porch. We weren't close, but they were friendly. I say hi, and she asked me if I know some blonde guy. I said, "No, why?" She told me some guy with blonde hair came by knocking on my door while they were outside earlier, and asked if they knew when I'd be home. It was that fucking magazine guy again. I told her how he'd come back earlier, and if they see him again, don't ever let him know I'm home. Her husband says he'll keep watch and make sure the guy goes away if they see him again. I thank them and head inside. I'm pretty weirded out at this point, but I try to just let it go. There's no way he'll try to come back again, and I could avoid him for what few days he has left here if he does try to come back. I assumed he wouldn't though because, what kind of weirdo does that shit? So the next day I didn't have to go into work until like 5 p.m, so I sat around and hung out all day and did some cleaning. It was a Friday night, and we usually got pretty busy at work. I had a mild drinking problem at this time. I was 20, so I say mild because I was just a kid that liked to drink a lot. So before I would go into work on weekends, I would have a couple drinks beforehand. Not to get drunk, but I would be a lot more social and outgoing, fun with customers. It's around 3 p.m. if I remember right, and I'm in the middle of my drink and feeling pretty good when someone knocks on my door. I forget the worries of yesterday, and just waltz over and open that bitch up, not looking through my peephole at all. Guess who? Motherfucking Blondie. Of course, in my slightly tipsy state, I'm all like, "Hey, what's up?" He tells me he got dropped off at the complex across the road and wasn't having much luck, so he figured he'd stop by and hang out with me again. Fuck it. Come on in, why the hell not? We have a couple drinks together and talk for a couple of hours again, and he keeps talking about quitting his job and getting a normal life and all that. It's then I start to wonder why he keeps calling it a normal life, and why he calls the group leader a sponsor sometimes. He starts telling me how cool I am and how he wishes he could meet more girls like me. He says he likes the city I live in a lot, and the people seem nice. Just a bunch of stuff like that. I started feeling kind of weird around him because he kept sitting closer to me and seemed to be getting more flirty. At this point, I decided I was done with this dude, and I wasn't answering the door for him anymore. I told him I had to get to work and to have a good night. In reality, I didn't have to be at work for another good half hour or more, but I just wanted him away from me and out of my apartment. Work goes great. Made mad tips. Came home with no incident, and neighbors didn't say anything to me. The next day, I'm out running some errands, and I get a text from Blondie again. He sent me like 5 or 6 in a row asking where I'm at, and to open my door because he's outside. How he just left his job like I told him to, and he needs a place to think about things. And how he knows I'm inside because he can hear me. First of all, I'm like, what the fuck? But second of all, I never told him to quit his job. I suggested that shit, and never offered to be his fallback plan. I tell him I'm not home and to leave. He says he can hear me inside, and he knows I'm lying. He was hearing my ferrets in their pen most likely. No one was ever in my apartment. He's pretty much freaking out on me over text and saying that he wants to move in with me and start a new life here in my city. He doesn't have the money to fly home, and he barely has money for food. He starts calling me over and over again, and leaves voicemails and keeps texting me. He finally says he'll just wait on me to get home and we can talk about it. No. I kept telling him he completely misunderstood me, and he needs to go back to his job. I don't want him around, and I don't even know him. I was just being friendly when he wanted to chat. I didn't want him to full-blown move in with me. As I'm getting all these messages and stuff, I'm driving to a sporting goods store. I don't have the money for a gun, and really at that point didn't even know how to go about buying one. And definitely didn't know how to use one, but I did know how to swing a bat. I played softball for 6 years. I can swing a damn bat. So, I bought a damn bat. I was shaking when I put it in the back seat of my car, still getting texts from him. I stopped reading them at this point because I was getting too upset and didn't even know how to reply or to deal with someone like this. I didn't want to go home yet because I was afraid he was there, but I didn't have anyone to call to help me. I drove up to the park and sat for about an hour and finally decided to go home. He wasn't there, but my neighbor's husband was outside when I got there. He said the guy had basically been beating on my door for almost an hour, and they threatened to call the cops, which, I guess, is what finally made him leave. I thanked him and went inside. After that, I never heard from him again. I don't know what the fuck was wrong with that guy, but he has some problems. I kept that baseball bat next to my front door from then on, and is next to my front door even now. Hey everyone, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to episode 61. Gotta admit, I'm kind of intrigued about what was going on with the guy in that last story. Sounded kind of cultish to me, but guess we'll never really know. As I'm recording this, I can see rather annoyingly that daylight is starting to creep in. That's probably a good time for me to think about going to bed. Okay, so until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.